The Boeing B-29 Superfortress was engineered to fight from the stratosphere, pressurized and untouchable at 32,000 feet, a fortress that could rain destruction while floating above the reach of enemy interceptors and flak. Japanese military observers called them high-altitude cowards, bombers too afraid to face real combat, machines that hid in the clouds and accomplished nothing. They were right, until March 9, 1945. That night, 325 of those cowards came in at 5,000 feet, stripped their guns, and burned Tokyo into ash. Before we go deeper into how this decision changed the Pacific War forever, make sure to subscribe for more history that actually happened. The story begins not with fire, but with precision. In the minds of American air power theorists in the years before Pearl Harbor, strategic bombing was a science of surgical strikes: identify the factory, the refinery, the rail yard, destroy it with high explosive bombs from high altitude, and watch an enemy's capacity to wage war collapse like a house of cards. This was the doctrine taught at Maxwell Field's Air Corps Tactical School in Alabama through the late 1930s, where officers like Hayward Hansel absorbed the gospel that bombers carrying enough defensive firepower could penetrate enemy territory unescorted, that the Norden bomb site could place ordnance within a 100-foot circle from 20,000 feet, that wars could be won by destroying an enemy's industrial web without burning their cities. It was a seductive vision, war made clean by technology, victory achieved through engineering rather than slaughter. When the B-29 emerged from Boeing's Seattle factories in 1943, it seemed purpose-built to fulfill that vision. Nothing like it had ever flown. For Wright AW-3350 duplex Cyclone 18-cylinder radial engines, each generating 2,200 horsepower, drove the Superfortress through the thin air where other bombers gasped and stalled. A wingspan of 141 feet lifted a maximum takeoff weight of 60 tons. The pressurized cabin system, developed by Garrett RA Research, allowed crews to operate in shirt sleeves at altitudes where the outside temperature dropped to 60 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. Remote-controlled gun turrets, directed by a central fire control computer, protected the aircraft's flanks and tail. The defensive armament consisted of 12 Browning M250 caliber machine guns and one 20mm cannon, all integrated into a system that could track targets with unprecedented accuracy. The bomb bay could swallow 20,000 pounds of ordnance. Range exceeded 3,200 miles. Service ceiling topped 36,000 feet. On paper, the B-29 was invincible. The United States government spent $3 billion developing and producing the Superfortress, more than the Manhattan Project's atomic bomb program. That investment reflected both the aircraft's revolutionary engineering and America's desperate need for a weapon that could strike Japan's home islands. By mid-1944, American forces had captured the Mariana Islands, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, placing Tokyo within the B-29's range for the first time. The XXI Bomber Command, under Brigadier General Hayward Hansel, established operations on these volcanic specks in the Pacific and prepared to demonstrate the power of precision strategic bombing. On November 24, 1944, 111 Superfortresses launched the first strike against Tokyo since the Doolittle raid 2.5 years earlier. Their target was the Nakajima Aircraft Company's Musashino engine plant on the city's western outskirts. Page 1. Japanese admirals called B-29 bombers high-altitude cowards. They firebombed Tokyo to ashes anyway. The raid failed. Fierce headwinds scattered the formation. Thick cloud cover obscured the target. Of the 111 bombers dispatched, only 24 even found the factory. Bombs fell across miles of empty landscape and into Tokyo Bay, where they killed fish in impressive numbers but destroyed nothing of military value. Hansel ordered more strikes. Each followed the same pattern, bombers climbing to 30,000 feet or higher, seeking clear skies, attempting to place high-explosive bombs on specific industrial facilities. And each raid disappointed. The jet stream, that river of air racing eastward at speed sometimes exceeding 250 miles per hour, made precision bombing from high altitude nearly impossible. Bombardiers watched helplessly as their carefully aimed ordnance drifted miles off target, pushed by winds no weather forecast had predicted. The B-29's right engines, still plagued by developmental problems, overheated catastrophically in the thin air of high-altitude cruise. Magnesium alloy components in the crankcases burned at temperatures approaching 5,600 degrees Fahrenheit when they caught fire, hot enough to melt through the main wing spar in seconds. Aircraft simply fell from the sky, their crews doomed before anyone could bail out. Between engine failures and fuel exhaustion fighting those murderous headwinds, more superfortresses ditched in the Pacific on the way home than were shot down by Japanese defenses. By January 1945, General Henry H. Arnold, commanding general of the United States Army Air Forces, had seen enough. Hansel, the true believer in precision bombing doctrine, was relieved. His replacement was Major General Curtis Emerson LeMay, a 38-year-old bomber commander who had earned a reputation for brutal effectiveness in both Europe and China. LeMay had led B-17 Flying Fortress formations through the nightmare of German airspace in 1943, developing tactics that reduced losses while increasing bomb tonnage on target. He pioneered the straight-line bomb run, no evasive maneuvers, no deviation from course regardless of flak or fighters, reasoning that steady flight gave bombardiers the best chance of hitting their marks and that tight formations concentrated defensive fire into killing zones no German pilot could penetrate without accepting death. When LeMay's crews began using these tactics, bombing accuracy improved dramatically. He was methodical, calculating, and entirely unmoved by the human cost of his decisions provided they advanced the objective. Arnold told LeMay the truth without euphemism: deliver results or be relieved like Hansel. The strategic bombing campaign against Japan had consumed vast resources and achieved almost nothing. Something had to change. LeMay inherited a command structure that was itself revolutionary. Unlike other air forces, which reported through theater commanders, the 20th Air Force answered directly to Arnold in Washington. This meant that neither General Douglas MacArthur in the Philippines nor Admiral Chester Nimitz in the Central Pacific could divert B-29s to tactical support missions. The superfortresses were reserved exclusively for strategic bombing, but strategic bombing had failed. In the 4 months since operations began from the Marianas, XXI Bomber Command had flown dozens of missions and damaged Japan's war production capacity by perhaps 2%. At this rate, the war would last another decade. LeMay understood he had perhaps 3 months to prove the B-29 could deliver decisive results. He spent his first weeks in command observing, analyzing, consulting with his staff. The problems were obvious. High-altitude precision bombing couldn't work under the weather conditions prevalent over Japan. From October through June, an average of only 7 days per month offered clear skies. The jet stream made accurate bombing nearly impossible even in good weather. Industrial facilities were dispersed, camouflaged, and hardened against high-explosive attack. Most critically, a significant portion of Japan's war. Page 2. Japanese admirals called B-29 bombers high-altitude cowards. They firebombed Tokyo to ashes anyway. Production occurred not in large factories but in thousands of small workshops scattered throughout residential neighborhoods. Destroying these cottage industries through precision bombing would require locating and striking tens of thousands of individual targets, an impossible task. But there existed an alternative approach, one that American planners had been developing since 1943. During that year, the Army Air Forces conducted tests at Dugway Proving Ground in Utah, where architects had constructed 2 clusters of buildings, one designed to replicate German urban construction in brick and stone, another built to Japanese specifications using wood, bamboo, and paper. Engineers then attacked these artificial villages with different munitions to determine which weapons caused the most destruction. The results were unambiguous. Against Japanese-style construction, incendiary weapons far exceeded high explosives in effectiveness. The M69 incendiary bomblet, a hexagonal tube 19 inches long and 3 inches in diameter, filled with napalm gel and weighing 6 pounds, could set fire to a wooden building with near certainty. Dropped in clusters from high altitude, the bomblet separated at 5,000 feet and rained down at terminal velocity. Upon impact, a fuse ignited a charge that sprayed burning napalm across a 15-meter radius, setting everything combustible ablaze. The tests at Dugway proved that under favorable conditions, massed incendiary attack could create firestorms, self-sustaining conflagrations that generated their own weather systems, with winds reaching hurricane force and temperatures hot enough to ignite flesh. Tokyo was the ideal target for such an attack. The city sprawled across hundreds of square miles of the Kanto Plain, but its dense core, where workers lived in neighborhoods called Shitamachi, the Low City, contained the highest concentration of both people and small-scale industrial production. In March 1945, approximately 1.1 million people lived in a 12-square-mile area east of the Sumida River, in the wards of Asakasa, Honjo, and Fukagawa. Population density exceeded 100,000 per square mile in some districts. Buildings stood wall to wall, separated by alleys barely wide enough for a single person to pass. Almost every structure was wooden, with walls of paper and bamboo. Roofs consisted of ceramic tile laid over wooden framework. There were no fire breaks. The Japanese government had ordered the demolition of more than 200,000 homes to create fire breaks throughout Tokyo, but the rubble had not been cleared, leaving combustible material stacked in piles exactly where fires would need to jump from one district to another. The city civil defense preparations were grossly inadequate. Tokyo's fire department employed approximately 8,000 professional firefighters across 287 stations, but these men lacked modern equipment. Most stations had no motorized engines. Hoses rotted and leaked. Water pressure in most areas was insufficient to fight large blazes. The government had organized civilians into neighborhood firefighting associations, giving each household rudimentary equipment, a bucket, a pump that could spray water a few meters, sand to smother flames. These provisions were useless against incendiary bombs. Few air raid shelters existed beyond crude foxholes dug in home gardens. The government discouraged construction of proper shelters on the theory that their existence would damage civilian morale by suggesting that air raids were a serious threat. The city had experienced one devastating firestorm in living memory, the Great Kanto earthquake of 1923, when seismic tremors toppled buildings and ignited fires that swept through the Shitamachi districts, killing over 100,000 people. That disaster demonstrated both how vulnerable the wooden city was to fire and how inadequate its defenses were against urban conflagration. American intelligence officers knew this history and factored it into their targeting recommendations. Page 3. Japanese admirals called B-29 bombers high-altitude cowards. They firebombed Tokyo to ashes anyway. Military defenses were no more formidable. The Imperial Japanese Army's 1st Anti-Aircraft Division deployed approximately 780 guns around Tokyo, but these weapons lacked effective fire control systems. Radar was primitive and short-ranged. Searchlights could illuminate targets, but the gunners who tried to hit them had to calculate range, bearing, and altitude with methods barely advanced from the First World War. Japanese doctrine called for anti-aircraft guns to establish a curtain of fire at predetermined altitudes, forcing bombers to fly through a zone of bursting shells. This worked reasonably well against massed formations at high altitude but became almost useless if attackers came in low, fast, and spread out. Night operations compounded the defenders' difficulties. The 10th Air Division, responsible for intercepting raids on Tokyo, operated approximately 210 aircraft in March 1945, but only 25 or 26 of these were specialized night fighters, Kawasaki Ki-45 Toryu and Nakajima J-1 Endgecko twin-engine aircraft equipped with radar and upward-firing cannon. The night fighter pilots were exhausted by an intensive training program and hampered by mechanical problems. Their radar often malfunctioned. Their tactics assumed that American bombers would arrive at high altitude in tight formations, allowing the night fighters to approach from below and use their upward-firing guns against the bombers' unprotected bellies. No one in the Japanese command structure anticipated that 300 bombers might attack at 5,000 feet. LeMay studied all of this intelligence through February 1945. On February 25, he ordered a large-scale incendiary test raid against Tokyo. 231 B-29s were dispatched, 172 reached the target, and they dropped their bombs from high altitude during daylight. The attack succeeded beyond expectations. Nearly 28,000 buildings burned to the ground. The fires consumed roughly 1 square mile of the city. LeMay and his staff analyzed the results and concluded that the tactic was viable but inefficient. Bombing from high altitude scattered the incendiaries across too wide an area. Many bomblets fell in streets, canals, or parks where they burned harmlessly. The key to maximum destruction was concentration, saturating a relatively small target area with such density of incendiaries that fires would merge and create the conditions for a true firestorm. Low-altitude attack solved this problem. At 5,000 to 7,000 feet, bombardiers could place their weapons far more accurately than at 30,000. The lower altitude also offered other advantages. B-29 engines ran cooler and more reliably in the denser air, reducing the risk of catastrophic mechanical failure. The bombers could carry more ordnance because they needed less fuel, flying low required less engine power than climbing to stratospheric altitudes, and the absence of violent headwinds meant fuel consumption dropped substantially. The aircraft could also fly faster at lower altitude, reducing their exposure time over the target. But low-altitude attack meant vulnerability to anti-aircraft fire and fighter interception. LeMay gambled that Japanese gunners' lack of effective fire control equipment would make them largely ineffective against bombers coming in low and fast at night. He further calculated that stripping most defensive guns from the B-29s would save enough weight to carry double the normal bomb load, and that the operational conditions, nighttime, low altitude, single aircraft approach rather than formation flying, would minimize the risk from night fighters. Not everyone agreed with this assessment. LeMay's intelligence staff predicted that casualties could reach 70%. Wing commanders expressed concern. Aircrews who heard the briefings responded with shock and fear. Everything in their training told them that high altitude offered safety and that removing defensive guns left them helpless. But LeMay had made his decision. The raid would proceed. He selected. Page 4. Japanese admirals called B-29 bombers high-altitude cowards. They firebombed Tokyo to ashes anyway. Tokyo as the primary target, specifically the Shitamachi district east of the Sumida River, an area his staff designated Zone I. This zone measured approximately 4 miles by 3 miles and contained more than 1 million people living in one of the most densely packed urban areas on Earth. American planners knew this. The orders distributed to bomber crews acknowledged that the attack was intended to destroy small factories dispersed throughout residential areas and explicitly noted that civilian casualties would disrupt war production by killing workers and destroying their homes. The language was bureaucratic, but the meaning was clear. This would be an attack on a city, not on a specific industrial target. The line between strategic bombing and area bombardment had dissolved. On March 8, LeMay issued the final operations order. The attack would commence the following night. 346 B-29s would be prepared. Defensive armament would be reduced to tail guns only. Each bomber would carry between 5 and 7 short tons of incendiary bombs, primarily M69 bomblets clustered in bundles that would break apart at altitude. Pathfinder aircraft would mark the target with M47 bombs, larger weapons containing napalm that burned with white-hot intensity, creating an aiming point visible from miles away. The main force would then saturate the target area. Bomber altitudes would be staggered between 5,000 and 7,000 feet, calculated to be too high for light anti-aircraft guns to engage effectively and below the optimum range of heavy guns. The aircraft would attack individually rather than in formation, approaching from different directions to confuse defenses. The raid would occur at night when weather conditions over Japan typically improved and when American navigation systems using LORAN radio signals functioned most accurately. Ground crews at North Field on Guam, at Aili Field on Saipan, and at Northwest Field on Tinian worked through the afternoon and night of March 9, loading bombs into the cavernous bellies of the superfortresses. Each M69 bomblet weighed 6 pounds. 47 of them filled a cylindrical cluster weighing 300 pounds. 110 clusters per aircraft meant 11,000 individual incendiary bomblets aboard each B-29. The bombs were stacked in the bomb bays until the aircraft rested on their landing gear struts with minimal clearance, loaded to their structural limits. Fuel tanks were filled to capacity, though the low-altitude mission profile required significantly less fuel than high-altitude raids. Armament crews removed every gun except those in the tail turret, saving thousands of pounds. Gunners except tail gunners stayed behind, another weight reduction. Maintenance crews inspected engines, checked pressurization systems, topped off oil reservoirs. The work continued until every available aircraft was ready. The first B-29 lifted off at 5:35 in the evening local time. One by one, at intervals measured in seconds, the silver bombers thundered down the crushed coral runways and clawed into the Pacific sky. The takeoffs continued for nearly 3 hours. 325 superfortresses departed, 169 from the 73rd Bombardment Wing on Saipan, 121 from the 313th Bombardment Wing, also on Saipan, and 56 from the 314th Bombardment Wing on Guam. Each aircraft carried its load of fire. They flew north through the darkness, individual aircraft separated by miles, climbing gradually to cruise altitude. Navigation was by dead reckoning and LORAN, with radio operators monitoring coded signals that allowed them to fix their position relative to ground stations. The flight lasted 6 hours. Weather over the ocean was turbulent, with the aircraft pitching and rolling through the night, but as they approached Japan the conditions improved. Visibility was good. Cloud cover was minimal. On the ground in Tokyo, the temperature. Page 5. Japanese admirals called B-29 bombers high-altitude cowards. They firebombed Tokyo to ashes anyway. Hovered just above freezing. Winds gusted from the southeast at 45 to 67 miles per hour, strong enough to spread fire but not strong enough to disrupt flight operations. For B-29s preceded the main force, arriving over Tokyo shortly before midnight. These were command aircraft, stripped of bombs and loaded with extra radios and fuel, crewed by the best radio operators in XXI Bomber Command. They circled at 25,000 feet, acting as airborne relay stations. This proved unnecessary. The raid was too compressed in time for complex coordination to matter, and individual crews knew their assignments, but LeMay wanted redundancy in case ground communications were disrupted. At 12:08 on the morning of March 10, 1945, the attack began. The Pathfinder bombers came in from perpendicular directions, their bombardiers releasing M47 incendiaries at precise intervals to create an X-shaped fire pattern over the target area. The M47s burst into flame on impact, each weapon generating a bonfire visible for miles. Within minutes, the aiming point was established, a brilliant X of white fire marking the center of Zone I. Behind the Pathfinders came the main force, 325 bombers converging on Tokyo from different headings, their crews watching the city appear before them as a vast dark expanse punctuated by the growing fires below. Each bomber group had been assigned a specific area within the larger target zone. The 73rd Bombardment Wing would strike the northern sections, the 313th would hit the southern districts, the 314th would fill in the gaps. As the bombers began their runs, bombardiers opened their bomb bay doors and released their loads. Clusters tumbled out, stabilized, and began their terminal descent. At 5,000 feet above the ground, barometric fuses triggered release mechanisms. The clusters broke apart. Hundreds of M69 bomblet scattered across the sky and plummeted downward. The first bomblet struck rooftops, streets, courtyards. Each impact drove the hexagonal tube through wooden shingles or paper walls. A fraction of a second later, the fuse ignited. White phosphorus charges inside the bomblet detonated, spraying napalm gel in all directions and igniting it simultaneously. Napalm burned at temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to melt glass and ignite wood on contact. The fires started immediately, not isolated blazes but hundreds, then thousands of separate conflagrations appearing across dozens of city blocks within a span of minutes. Each bomber released approximately 11,000 incendiaries. By the time the fifth aircraft completed its bomb run, more than 50,000 individual fire sources were burning below. The wooden buildings of Shitamachi had no chance. Flames spread from house to house, jumping across narrow alleys, climbing walls, consuming roofs. Within 15 minutes of the first Pathfinder strike, 100 city blocks were ablaze. Tokyo's defenders struggled to respond. Air raid sirens wailed, but many residents ignored them, conditioned by months of raids that caused minimal damage. Those who did react found their preparations worthless. Families ran from their homes carrying buckets of water or sand, intending to extinguish incendiary bombs as they had been trained to do, and discovered that hundreds of fires were already burning out of control. Firefighters responded to reports of blazes only to find entire neighborhoods engulfed. Water pressure failed as pumping stations lost power. Hoses melted in the heat. Fire trucks became trapped by falling debris. The professional firefighters conceded defeat within 14 minutes of the raid's commencement, radiating headquarters that the fires were beyond control. Anti-aircraft guns fired blind into the sky, launching shells at the sound of engines, but without effective fire control the gunners merely wasted ammunition. Searchlights swept the darkness, occasionally catching a BA-29 in their beams, and the nearby guns concentrated their fire. Page 6. Japanese admirals called B-29 bombers high-altitude cowards. They firebombed Tokyo to ashes anyway. On the illuminated target, a few aircraft sustained damage. Most flew through the flak unscathed. The low altitude and high speed made tracking difficult. By the time gunners adjusted their aim, the target had moved beyond range. Japanese night fighters took off from their bases around Tokyo but achieved little. The pilots had difficulty locating individual bombers in the darkness and smoke. Their radar, temperamental under the best conditions, malfunctioned more often than it worked. When pilots did make contact, they found the B-29s were flying too fast and too low for effective interception. The standard tactic of approaching from below and using upward-firing cannon failed because the bombers were already at 5,000 feet, barely high enough to allow a fighter to position itself underneath without hitting the ground. Several night fighters did engage, and their gunfire downed at least a few B-29s, but the defenders could not mount a coordinated defense. The bomber stream lasted over 2 hours, with aircraft arriving over the target in an almost continuous flow. Defensive systems designed to counter concentrated formations were overwhelmed by the sheer number and dispersion of individual attackers. As more bombers released their loads, the fires below merged and intensified. The conditions for a true firestorm developed within an hour of the raid's start. A firestorm is a phenomenon that occurs when numerous large fires combine to create a single massive convective column. The intense heat generates powerful updrafts, which draw in air from all directions at ground level. These inflows create winds that can reach hurricane force, further fanning the flames and spreading the fire outward. The updrafts also carry burning debris thousands of feet into the air, where it rains down on adjacent neighborhoods, starting new fires ahead of the main conflagration's advancing front. Temperatures in the fire's core can exceed 1800 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to spontaneously ignite materials that would normally be fire-resistant. Oxygen levels plummet as combustion consumes the available air faster than it can be replenished. People caught in a firestorm typically die from asphyxiation before the flames reach them, their lungs seared by superheated air stripped of oxygen. This is what happened in Tokyo on the night of March 9 to 10, 1945. By 1 o'clock in the morning, the firestorm was fully developed. Winds reaching 60 miles per hour roared through the streets, feeding oxygen to the flames and spreading fire faster than any human could run. The heat became so intense that clothing ignited spontaneously on people hundreds of meters from the nearest flames. Glass windows liquefied and dripped like water. Metal fittings in buildings glowed cherry red. The air itself seemed to burn. Thousands of people fled their homes and ran toward the only refuges they knew: rivers, canals, parks, schoolyards with large swimming pools. They found no safety. The Sumida River, which bisected the target area, became clogged with bodies as people waded in seeking relief from the heat and were overcome by smoke and fumes. Some drowned. Others died from thermal shock when their superheated bodies entered cold water. The next morning, thousands of corpses floated in the river or lay stacked along its banks like cordwood. Schools became killing grounds. The Futaba Primary School, built of brick with a large swimming pool, attracted thousands seeking shelter. The pool was full when the first refugees arrived. By morning it was dry, the water having boiled away, its bottom covered with carbonized bodies. People who took refuge in the brick school buildings fared no better. The structures survived, but the interior temperatures rose to levels that cooked human flesh like meat in an oven. Rescuers who entered the buildings the next day found bodies preserved in their final poses, mothers crouched over children, attempting to shield them with their bodies. Page 7. Japanese admirals called B-29 bombers high-altitude cowards. They firebombed Tokyo to ashes anyway. All dead not from flame but from heat. Parks and open spaces offered no protection. The firestorm's winds carried burning embers that started new fires wherever combustible material existed. People who thought they had reached safety in open areas found themselves surrounded by advancing walls of flame. Aboard the B-29s, the crews witnessed the horror they had created. The fires below generated such intense light that some bombardiers reported being able to read in their aircraft by the glow. Pilots felt the heat through their aircraft's aluminum skin. The convective turbulence from the firestorm tossed 20-ton bombers through the sky like leaves in a storm. Several aircraft were flipped inverted by updrafts, their pilots fighting for control as altimeters showed 1,000-foot altitude changes in seconds. The updrafts were so powerful that some B-29s were lifted thousands of feet above their intended bombing altitude, forcing crews to fight to descend back into bombing range. The turbulence was violent enough that some airmen were thrown against bulkheads and injured. Several aircraft sustained structural damage from the forces involved. The smell reached the aircraft long before they approached the target. Crews reported an odor that permeated their planes, seeping through every seal and gap in the pressurization system, the unmistakable stench of burning flesh. It clung to their flight suits, contaminated their oxygen masks, and remained in their aircraft for days afterward. Some men vomited. Others required oxygen masks even though their aircraft were pressurized, unable to tolerate the smell. Bombardiers and pilots who looked down during their bomb runs saw not just fire but movement, rivers of people fleeing through streets, visible as dark masses against the flames, flowing toward water or open areas and then simply disappearing as the fire overtook them. The light from the fires was so intense that reconnaissance photographers aboard some aircraft were able to capture images even though it was the middle of the night. The raid lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes. 279 B-29s released their bombs over Tokyo. Another 19 aircraft aborted the primary mission due to mechanical problems or crew decisions and struck alternate targets. Approximately 1,665 short tons of incendiary bombs fell on Tokyo that night, over 3 million pounds of napalm-filled bomblets that cascaded across the Shitamachi districts in a rain of fire. The last bomber departed the target area around 3 in the morning. Below them, Tokyo burned. Smoke rose in a column that reached 30,000 feet, visible from more than 100 miles away. Pilots flying home could see the glow on the horizon behind them until they were halfway back to the Marianas. American losses were remarkably light given the scale of the operation. 14 B-29s were shot down or crashed, with 96 airmen killed or missing. Most losses occurred due to mechanical failures or navigation errors rather than enemy action. The Japanese defenses, despite the defenders' best efforts, had been almost entirely ineffective. LeMay's gamble on low-altitude attack proved correct. The reduced defensive armament did not materially increase vulnerability because the night fighters and flak gunners couldn't track and engage individual aircraft effectively regardless of how many guns the bombers carried. The removal of unnecessary weight allowed each aircraft to carry twice its normal bomb load, effectively doubling the raid's destructive power without increasing the number of sorties required. On the ground in Tokyo, the fires burned for days. The final casualty count was impossible to determine with precision. Japanese authorities estimated that between 90,000 and 100,000 people died during the raid and in the immediate aftermath, more deaths in a single night than resulted from either atomic bomb attack later that year. Approximately 1 million people lost their homes. Roughly 16. Page 8. Japanese admirals called B-29 bombers high-altitude cowards. They firebombed Tokyo to ashes anyway. Square miles of the city, more than 25% of Tokyo's total area, had been reduced to ash. Within the target zone, almost nothing survived. Aerial reconnaissance photographs taken the day after the raid showed block after block of empty grey space where dense urban neighborhoods had existed hours before. The wooden buildings had burned so completely that in many areas not even foundations remained, just ash and scattered debris. The few structures that survived were brick or concrete warehouses and public buildings standing alone in a wasteland. The strategic impact was immediate and profound. Tokyo's capacity for war production was cut in half. The small workshops that had produced components for larger factories were gone. The workers who staffed those workshops were dead or displaced. Transportation infrastructure was destroyed. Food distribution systems collapsed. Survivors fled the city by the hundreds of thousands, clogging roads and overwhelming the capacity of other cities to absorb them. Morale among the civilian population plummeted. For the first time, many Japanese understood that the war was lost, that their government could not protect them, that more destruction was inevitable. Military planners in the United States saw Operation Meeting House as a complete success. The raid had demonstrated that incendiary bombing from low altitude could devastate Japanese cities with acceptable losses. LeMay immediately planned follow-up attacks. Over the next 10 days, XXI Bomber Command struck Nagoya, Osaka, and Kobe with similar tactics, burning significant portions of each city. The firebombing campaign continued through the summer of 1945, systematically reducing Japan's urban areas to ash. By August, when the war ended, American B-29s had burned out more than 60 of Japan's largest cities. Total civilian casualties from the incendiary campaign exceeded those from the atomic bombs by a significant margin. The moral and legal questions raised by the Tokyo firebombing have never been fully resolved. International law as it existed in 1945 prohibited the deliberate targeting of civilian populations, though the practical interpretation of this principle during World War II was inconsistent at best. Both Germany and Japan had conducted area bombing campaigns against cities throughout the war with no pretense of precision. Britain's Bomber Command had explicitly adopted city bombing as a strategy from 1942 onward. The United States maintained the fiction that even its area attacks targeted military-industrial objectives, but the reality was transparent to everyone involved. The orders for Operation Meeting House acknowledged that the attack was intended to kill civilian workers and destroy their homes as a means of reducing industrial production. The target selection deliberately focused on residential areas where small workshops were dispersed rather than on large factories where precision bombing might have spared surrounding neighborhoods. Defenders of the firebombing campaign argue that it was militarily necessary and ultimately reduced total casualties by hastening Japan's surrender and making an invasion of the home islands unnecessary. The alternative, an amphibious assault on Japan, was projected to cost hundreds of thousands of American casualties and potentially millions of Japanese deaths as civilians mobilized to resist invasion. From this perspective, burning 60 cities and killing several 100,000 people was the lesser evil compared to a ground campaign that might have killed millions. Critics counter that the firebombing constituted a war crime regardless of its strategic justification, that deliberately incinerating civilians by the hundreds of thousands violated fundamental principles of warfare, and that alternative strategies including blockade and conventional precision bombing might have achieved surrender without resorting to indiscriminate area. Page 9. Japanese admirals called B-29 bombers high-altitude cowards. They firebombed Tokyo to ashes anyway. Attacks. The debate has no clear answer, only competing moral frameworks that weight different values differently. What is indisputable is that Operation Meeting House represented a fundamental shift in the nature of strategic bombing. The doctrine of precision attack on industrial targets had evolved, or devolved, into a campaign of urban destruction that made no meaningful distinction between factory workers and their families. The B-29 Superfortress, designed and built to be the ultimate precision bombing weapon, became instead the instrument of the most destructive area attacks in history. The aircraft's technical capabilities, its altitude ceiling, its pressurized cabin, its defensive armament, proved largely irrelevant to its actual employment. What mattered was not that it could fly above enemy defenses but that it could carry massive bomb loads over transoceanic distances. The sophistication of its systems was wasted on missions that required only the ability to reach the target and drop incendiaries on a city-sized aim point. Curtis LeMay never expressed public regret for the firebombing campaign. In his post-war memoir, he acknowledged that if the United States had lost the war, he would likely have been tried as a war criminal for his actions. He also maintained that the attacks were necessary and effective, that they broke Japan's will to resist and saved lives by bringing the war to a rapid conclusion. LeMay went on to a long career in the Air Force, eventually serving as Chief of Staff and developing the Strategic Air Command into the primary instrument of American nuclear deterrence during the Cold War. His willingness to use overwhelming force without hesitation defined his reputation. Iron Ass remained his nickname, a term that mixed respect for his effectiveness with acknowledgement of his ruthlessness. He understood that history would judge him harshly, but he was untroubled by that prospect, convinced that the decisions he made were correct given the information and pressures that existed in March 1945. For Japan, Operation Meeting House marked the beginning of the end. The firebombing campaign that followed through the summer reduced the country's major cities to ruins. War production collapsed not because specific factories were destroyed but because the workers had nowhere to live, the transportation systems were gone, and the social infrastructure that supported industrial activity had been burned away. By August 1945, when the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, most of Japan's urban population had already experienced the terror of firebombing. The atomic weapons were in some respects simply a more efficient delivery system for the same strategic objective, urban destruction on a scale that made continued resistance obviously futile. The decision to surrender followed from accumulated destruction rather than any single attack, though the atomic bombs provided a face-saving excuse for the Japanese government to accept terms that had become militarily inevitable months earlier. For the B-29 superfortress, Tokyo's destruction validated its existence but undermined the doctrinal assumptions that had driven its design. The aircraft proved capable of decisive strategic effect, but not through the precise surgical strikes envisioned by pre-war air power theorists. Instead, it succeeded through the brute application of incendiary force against urban targets, a tactic that required none of the sophisticated systems that made the B-29 so expensive and complex to build and operate. The pressurization system was unnecessary for low-altitude missions. The remote control turrets were removed to save weight. The Norden bombsight's vaunted accuracy was irrelevant when the target was measured in square miles rather than meters. In effect, the B-29 had become an incredibly sophisticated truck for hauling napalm across the Pacific and dumping it on cities. That it could do this effectively was not in doubt. Whether it needed to be a. Page 10. Japanese admirals called B-29 bombers high-altitude cowards. They firebombed Tokyo to ashes anyway. $3 billion truck was a question that no one in 1945 had time to consider. The technical legacy of the B-29 extended far beyond World War II. Its pressurized cabin design influenced every high-altitude aircraft that followed. The remote-controlled turret systems anticipated automated defensive systems that would appear on later bombers. The Wright UB-3350 engines, once their early problems were resolved through improved cooling and materials, powered commercial and military aircraft for decades. The B-29 structure and systems provided the basis for the B-50, the KCR-97 tanker, and indirectly influenced the B-52 Stratofortress that would dominate American strategic bombing for more than half a century. Soviet engineers who examined B-29s that had force-landed in Russia during the war reverse-engineered the design and produced the Tupolev Tu-4, giving the Soviet Union its first modern heavy bomber. The aircraft's influence on aviation technology was profound and lasting. But the operational legacy was simpler and darker. Operation Meeting House demonstrated that modern air power could destroy cities with efficiency that previous generations could not have imagined. 325 aircraft, carrying conventional weapons, could in a single night kill more people and cause more destruction than entire armies had managed in weeks of ground combat during previous wars. This capability would define strategic thinking for the remainder of the 20th century. The nuclear weapons that followed did not fundamentally change the equation, they merely compressed the timeline, allowing one bomber to accomplish what had previously required hundreds. The principle remained the same: air power could deliver destruction on a scale that made defense impossible and rendered entire populations vulnerable to attack regardless of their distance from any battlefield. Tokyo rebuilt. The Shitamachi districts that burned in March 1945 were reconstructed, this time with modern fire breaks, concrete buildings, and comprehensive fire protection systems. Memorials mark the sites where the greatest casualties occurred. The Tokyo Metropolitan Government operates a museum dedicated to the air raids, preserving photographs, artifacts, and survivor testimonies. Each March 10th, memorial services are held for those who died. The Japanese name for the raid is TKY-DKSH, the Great Tokyo Air Raid, a designation that captures both its scale and its horror. Survivors spoke of the night in terms of absolute destruction: winds that carried fire, heat that killed without flame, smoke that suffocated, rivers clogged with bodies, streets lined with charcoaled corpses. Their testimony provides the human detail that statistics cannot capture, reminding later generations that behind the numbers measuring square miles destroyed and tons of bombs dropped were families, neighborhoods, communities erased in a span of hours. The B-29 crews who flew Operation Meeting House returned to their bases exhausted and shaken. Most had never witnessed destruction on this scale. Many struggled with what they had done. Orders and military necessity provided a framework that made the mission acceptable in the moment, but the smell of burning flesh that permeated their aircraft and the sight of a city consumed by fire left psychological scars. Some crew members spoke openly about their moral doubts. Others rationalized the attack as necessary to end the war, to save American lives, to punish Japan for Pearl Harbor and the atrocities committed throughout Asia. A few embraced their role with grim satisfaction, convinced that the Japanese population deserved whatever destruction came to them. Most fell somewhere in between, troubled but resigned, aware that they had participated in something terrible but unable or unwilling to refuse their orders or question the broader strategy. The firebombing campaign continued without pause. LeMay ordered raids on more cities, each following the page 11. Japanese admirals called B-29 bombers high-altitude cowards. They firebombed Tokyo to ashes anyway. Same pattern: low-altitude, nighttime attack, incendiary saturation. Nagoya burned on March 11th. Osaka on March 13th and 14th. Kobe on March 16th and 17th. Nagoya again on March 19th. By the end of March, 4 of Japan's 6 largest cities had experienced devastating firebomb raids. Only Tokyo and Yokohama had escaped complete destruction, and Tokyo would be hit again multiple times before the war ended. The campaign expanded to include smaller cities as stockpiles of incendiaries were replenished and additional B-29s arrived in the Marianas to replace losses and expand the force. By August, even cities with populations under 100,000 were being systematically burned. The destruction was comprehensive and methodical, executed with industrial efficiency by crews who flew their missions, returned to base, rested, and launched again on the next target with little variation in tactics or results. The Strategic Bombing Survey conducted by American analysts after the war concluded that the firebombing campaign had been decisive in bringing about Japan's surrender. Industrial production collapsed, transportation networks were destroyed, and civilian morale disintegrated under the sustained assault. Food supplies dwindled as distribution systems failed. Power generation capacity dropped as workers fled the cities and facilities were damaged. The survey's authors noted that Japan would likely have surrendered by November 1945 even without the atomic bombs or a planned invasion, simply because the firebombing had destroyed the country's capacity to sustain organized resistance. This conclusion remains controversial, as it is impossible to prove what would have happened in a counterfactual scenario. What is certain is that by August 1945, Japan's major cities were in ruins, its population was on the edge of starvation, and its government had lost the ability to protect its citizens from air attack. The lessons drawn from the firebombing campaign influenced strategic thinking throughout the Cold War. American military planners concluded that massed bomber attacks with either conventional or nuclear weapons could devastate an enemy's industrial capacity and break their will to fight. This belief drove the development of massive bomber fleets, intercontinental ballistic missiles, and nuclear arsenals sized to destroy entire nations. The doctrine of mutually assured destruction rested on the premise established over Tokyo, that cities could be obliterated with such speed and completeness that no defense was possible. The B-29 successors, from the B-36 to the B-52 to the B-2 Spirit, were designed to deliver this kind of destruction with ever greater efficiency. The fact that these weapons were never used in a general war between major powers reflects not a rejection of the strategic principles validated over Tokyo but rather the success of deterrence based on the mutual recognition that such weapons could indeed do what they were designed to do. For the Japanese officers who had dismissed the B-29 as a high-altitude coward, events proved them catastrophically wrong in their assessment but tragically correct in their contempt. The superfortress did operate as they predicted when it attacked from 30,000 feet, ineffectively, scattering bombs to no purpose, achieving little. When it descended to fighting altitude and stripped away its defensive pretenses, it became the instrument of Japan's destruction not through courage or tactical brilliance but through the remorseless application of firepower against undefended populations. There was no honor in this kind of warfare, no test of martial skill, only the mechanics of burning cities and counting bodies. The Japanese had built a military culture around the concept of decisive battle between warriors, where courage and spirit could overcome material disadvantage. The B-29 campaign made that culture irrelevant, demonstrating that modern warfare could bypass armies entirely and strike directly at the societies they existed to protect. Page 12. Japanese admirals called B-29 bombers high-altitude cowards. They firebombed Tokyo to ashes anyway. Tokyo's destruction was a defeat more absolute than any battlefield loss could have been, because it rendered the entire framework of traditional warfare obsolete. The engineering challenges that Boeing overcame to create the B-29 deserve fuller examination, for they reveal how deeply American aviation had committed to a vision of warfare that would prove irrelevant. The Superfortress emerged from specifications issued in January 1940 when the Army Air Corps demanded a bomber capable of flying 5,000 miles round-trip with a bomb load of 2,000 pounds, or flying 2,000 miles with 10,000 pounds of bombs. These requirements exceeded anything then possible. Boeing's Model 345 proposal promised performance that seemed almost fantastical, a pressurized cabin that would allow crews to operate comfortably at altitudes where unpressurized aircraft crews would lose consciousness, engines powerful enough to lift 60 tons of aircraft and payload to 35,000 feet, defensive systems sophisticated enough to protect the bomber without fighter escort. The prototype XB-29 first flew on September 21, 1942, and immediately revealed that ambition had outstripped engineering capability. The Wright UB-3350 engines caught fire on every early test flight. The airframe's structure proved inadequate for the stresses of combat loading. The pressurization system leaked. The remote-controlled gun turrets jammed. Fire control computers malfunctioned. Landing gear collapsed. Yet production proceeded at emergency pace because America needed the B-29 operational before Japan could consolidate its conquered empire. Between 1943 and 1945, Boeing, Bell Aircraft, and the Glenn L. Martin Company manufactured 3,928 B-29s at a cost averaging $600,000 per aircraft. Adjusted for inflation, each Superfortress cost approximately $9 million in 2020 currency. The entire program consumed resources equivalent to roughly $43 billion in modern terms, an investment larger than most nations' entire defense budgets. The pilots and crew who flew these machines understood their aircraft's capabilities and limitations through hard-won experience. A B-29 crew consisted of 11 men: pilot, co-pilot, bombardier, flight engineer, navigator, radio operator, radar operator, and 4 gunners. The aircraft commander typically held the rank of captain or major, with hundreds of hours of flight training. The co-pilot assisted with flight operations and took over if the commander was killed or incapacitated. The bombardier, positioned in the nose compartment alongside the navigator, operated the northern bomb sight during attack runs. The flight engineer monitored engine performance, fuel consumption, and system status from a station between and behind the pilots. The navigator plotted courses using dead reckoning, celestial observation, and radio navigation aids. The radio operator maintained communications with command aircraft and ground stations. The radar operator used the aircraft's AN/APQ-13 radar system to identify targets when visual bombing was impossible. The 4 gunners, top, belly, tail, and in some configurations side gunners, operated remote turrets from pressurized compartments, tracking targets through optical sights linked to fire control computers that calculated deflection and lead. In practice, the sophisticated gunnery system proved less effective than hoped, as computing the 3-dimensional trajectory of a moving target from a moving platform exceeded the mechanical computer's capabilities under combat conditions. Most successful defensive engagements occurred when gunners simply aimed at attacking fighters and fired continuously, relying on volume of fire rather than precision. Combat missions from the Marianas to Japan pushed B-29 crews to their limits. A typical mission began with briefing for hours before takeoff, when crews learned their target, route, altitude, bomb load, and expected opposition. Pre-flight inspection followed, pilots walking around their aircraft checking for obvious damage. Page 13. Japanese admirals called B-29 bombers high-altitude cowards, they firebombed Tokyo to ashes anyway. Fluid leaks, or loose components, while flight engineers examined engine nacelles and verified fuel loads. Takeoff from the crushed coral runways in the Marianas required careful technique, as a fully loaded Superfortress barely achieved flying speed by the runway's end, and any engine failure during the takeoff roll meant a fiery crash into the ocean beyond the field's perimeter. Once airborne, the climb to cruise altitude took over an hour, during which pilots carefully monitored engine temperatures and cylinder head readings, watching for the first signs of the overheating that presaged catastrophic failure. The flight north to Japan lasted 6 to 7 hours, a period of boredom punctuated by tension as crews maintained radio silence, navigated by star shots and LORAN, and watched for signs of mechanical problems. Over the target, vulnerability concentrated into minutes of terror as flak burst around the aircraft, fighters attacked from unexpected angles, and the bombardier struggled to line up the bomb sight while the pilot held course despite every instinct screaming to evade. The return flight brought exhaustion, fuel anxiety as engines consumed more gasoline than calculated, and the ever-present fear of ditching in the Pacific hundreds of miles from rescue. Crews who completed missions landed with fuel tanks nearly empty, their aircraft riddled with flak damage, often with wounded or dead crew members aboard. Those who failed to return simply disappeared, their aircraft plummeting into the ocean or exploding in midair, leaving no trace beyond a missing serial number on the mission summary. The paradox of the B-29 Superfortress is that it achieved its greatest success by abandoning the principles that justified its creation. It was engineered to be a precision instrument, and it succeeded by becoming a blunt weapon. It was designed to strike from altitudes where it could not be touched, and it proved most effective when it descended into the envelope where it was vulnerable. It carried the most sophisticated bombing technology ever developed, and it won the war by dumping incendiaries on city-sized targets where precision was unnecessary. The aircraft itself was magnificent, a triumph of engineering that pushed the boundaries of what was possible in 1945. Its employment was something else entirely, an application of air power that disregarded the careful doctrinal theories developed over decades and embraced instead the brutal expedients of burning cities until the enemy surrendered. History remembers the B-29 for both accomplishments, the technical achievement it represented and the destruction it delivered. The two cannot be separated. The aftermath of Operation Meeting House extended beyond immediate destruction to reshape Japanese society in ways that American planners neither anticipated nor fully understood. The mass displacement of populations created refugee crises that overwhelmed Japan's capacity to respond. 1 million people rendered homeless by the Tokyo raid fled to rural areas where housing, food, and employment did not exist in sufficient quantities to accommodate them. Families that had lived in Tokyo for generations found themselves dependent on distant relatives in villages that lacked resources to support additional mouths. The Japanese government's rationing system, already strained by wartime shortages and submarine interdiction of food imports, collapsed entirely in many areas as displaced populations moved beyond the reach of distribution networks. Malnutrition became endemic. Children showed signs of protein deficiency and vitamin disorders. Elderly and infirm refugees died in significant numbers during the spring and summer of 1945, victims not of fire but of the social disruption that followed. The psychological trauma affected survivors for decades. Many developed what modern medicine would recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, manifesting as nightmares, hypervigilance, panic attacks triggered by sounds resembling air raid sirens or the smell of smoke. Survivors' accounts recorded decades after the war describe persistent anxiety, depression. Page 14. Japanese admirals called B-29 bombers high-altitude cowards, they firebombed Tokyo to ashes anyway. And survivors' guilt that damaged relationships and limited their capacity to function in post-war society. Children who experienced the firebombing carried memories of burning neighborhoods, family members dying in flames, and hours spent hiding in inadequate shelters while fire raged outside. These childhood experiences shaped an entire generation's worldview, creating a deep-seated pacifism and opposition to military conflict that would influence Japanese politics and culture through the remainder of the 20th century. The physical reconstruction of Tokyo began almost immediately after the war's end in August 1945, but the city that emerged bore little resemblance to what had been destroyed. American occupation authorities, led by General Douglas MacArthur, imposed urban planning requirements that mandated wider streets, fire breaks, and construction standards designed to prevent future firestorm conditions. The wooden buildings that had characterized Shitamachi districts were largely replaced by concrete and steel structures, fundamentally altering the aesthetic and social character of these neighborhoods. Traditional community networks, which had been organized around Buddhist temples and Shinto shrines that served as focal points for neighborhood life, dissolved as residents scattered and did not return. The intimate scale of pre-war Tokyo, where residents knew their neighbors across multiple generations and social bonds were reinforced through daily interaction in narrow alleys and shared courtyard spaces, gave way to a more impersonal urban environment of wider streets, larger buildings, and populations less rooted in specific localities. This transformation was not simply physical but cultural, marking a break with centuries of urban tradition that the firebombing had made irreversible. Historians studying Tokyo's post-war development note that the city lost much of its distinctive character in the reconstruction, becoming more similar to Western cities in layout and social organization, a change that began with Operation Meeting House destruction of the traditional urban fabric. The human stories behind the casualty statistics reveal details that strategic analysis cannot capture. Survivor testimonies collected by Japanese historians and preserved in oral history archives describe experiences that transcend dry recitations of tactics and tonnage. One survivor, Masaharu Otake, then a child of 13, recalled watching his mother carry his infant sister into the Sumida River seeking safety from the flames, only to see both disappear beneath the surface, pushed under by panicking crowds. Another, Haruyo Naihai, described how her family took refuge in a concrete water cistern in their neighborhood, lying in waist-deep water for hours while fire raged overhead, emerging to find every building within sight reduced to ash and hundreds of bodies piled in the streets. Michiko Kiyoka remembered fleeing with her family toward Uyeno Park, believing the open space would provide safety, only to be caught in the firestorm's peripheral winds that ignited her father's clothing and burned him to death before her eyes. These individual accounts, repeated thousands of times with variations, compose the human reality of Operation Meeting House that no amount of operational analysis can adequately convey. The survivors who recorded their experiences decades later uniformly described the raid as an event beyond their psychological capacity to process at the time, an experience so overwhelming that memory fractured into disconnected images, flames that seemed alive, heat that felt solid, sounds of screaming that merged into a constant roar, the smell of burning that would trigger nausea for years afterward. Many survivors described a sense of unreality, as if they were observing events happen to someone else rather than directly experiencing them, a dissociative response that psychologists recognize as a coping mechanism when trauma exceeds the mind's capacity to integrate experience. Page 15. Japanese admirals called B-29 bombers high-altitude cowards, they firebombed Tokyo to ashes anyway. The international legal implications of area bombing and the firebombing campaign remain contested. The Hague Conventions of 1899 and 1907, which constituted international law regarding warfare at the time of Operation Meeting House, prohibited bombardment of undefended towns and required that attacks distinguish between military objectives and civilian populations. The conventions did not explicitly address aerial bombing, as powered flight was in its infancy when these treaties were negotiated, but their principles implied that area attacks on cities would violate international norms. In practice, all major combatants in World War II interpreted these restrictions narrowly or ignored them entirely. Germany initiated area bombing with attacks on Warsaw, Rotterdam, and London. Japan devastated Chinese cities including Chongqing, Changsha, and dozens of others. Britain's Bomber Command explicitly adopted area bombing as policy in 1942, with Air Marshal Arthur Harris directing attacks on German cities that killed hundreds of thousands of civilians. The United States, despite official rhetoric emphasizing precision bombing, conducted increasingly indiscriminate attacks as the war progressed, culminating in the firebombing campaigns against Japan and participation in area raids on German cities including Dresden. After the war, the victorious powers chose not to prosecute strategic bombing as a war crime, recognizing that all sides had engaged in similar practices and that establishing precedent against area bombing might constrain future military options. The Nuremberg and Tokyo war crimes tribunals focused on conventional war crimes, mistreatment of prisoners, massacre of civilians, aggressive warfare, but did not address strategic bombing, effectively establishing that area attacks on cities, regardless of their human cost, fell within the bounds of permissible warfare if conducted by states engaged in total war. This legal ambiguity persists, with contemporary international humanitarian law prohibiting attacks that cannot distinguish between military and civilian targets, yet lacking effective enforcement mechanisms when major powers decide that strategic necessity justifies civilian casualties. In the end, the story of the B-29's firebombing of Tokyo is a story about the gap between how wars are imagined and how they are fought. Pre-war planners envisioned clean, precise campaigns that would cripple an enemy's industrial capacity while sparing civilians. Reality delivered burning cities, mass casualties, and the calculated destruction of urban populations as a means to strategic ends. The transformation occurred not because anyone planned it but because operational necessity and battlefield conditions made the ideal tactics impossible and the effective tactics morally compromising. Curtis LeMay understood this and made his choice, but the decision's weight can be measured in the details that statistics obscure. Consider the ground crews on Guam, Saipan, and Tinian who loaded the incendiary bombs into each B-29's belly, young men barely out of their teens, working through tropical heat and humidity, handling bomblets that weighed 6 pounds each, 11,000 per aircraft, 325 aircraft, over 3.5 million individual firebombs prepared for a single night's work. Each cluster had to be properly fused, checked, and secured. A single mistake in assembly could cause a bomb to detonate prematurely, destroying the aircraft and killing its crew. The ground crews understood what these weapons would do, knew that their careful work would translate into thousands of fires and tens of thousands of deaths, yet they performed their tasks with professional competence because this was their assigned mission and they had been trained to believe that hastening Japan's defeat justified whatever means proved necessary. Consider the Pathfinder crews who marked the target that night, flying ahead of the main force to establish the aiming point, knowing that their actions would guide hundreds of bombers to burn a specific neighborhood where over 1 million people lived. These were XXI Bomber Command's most experienced crews, selected for their skill and reliability, men who had flown dozens of missions and survived when others. Page 16. Japanese admirals called B-29 bombers high-altitude cowards. They firebombed Tokyo to ashes anyway. Had not. They arrived over Tokyo first, exposed to the full fury of Japanese defenses with no support, and deliberately placed their firebombs to create a pattern that would maximize destruction. The responsibility was not abstract, they could see the city below them, see the lights of homes where families were settling in for the night, and they opened their bomb bays and released their loads because this was the mission and soldiers follow orders regardless of personal misgivings. The Pathfinder bombardiers watched their aiming points ignite below them and then circled to observe as the main force arrived and transformed their markers into an inferno that would consume 16 square miles of urban landscape. When these crews returned to base and filed their mission reports, they described the operation in technical language: target marked at designated coordinates, fires observed spreading per expectations, mission objectives achieved, a bureaucratic vocabulary that created distance between action and consequence, allowing them to function despite what they had done. The crews who flew the missions followed their orders and lived with the consequences. The people of Tokyo suffered and died because they happened to live in a wooden city within range of bombers that needed to prove they could deliver results. No one directly involved had clean hands. The war ended sooner than it might have otherwise. Hundreds of thousands of Japanese civilians ultimately paid the terrible price for that acceleration. These facts coexist without resolution, a testament to war's remorseless capacity to grind moral principles into ash along with everything else it touches and consumes. If this story gave you a new way to see the Pacific War, like, share, and subscribe, and tell us which moment surprised you most. We'll return next week with another chapter in the war that changed the world.